We have a very exciting panel today of people who really need no introduction. Jonathan Brent was the longtime editor of Yale University Press's Annals of Communism series, which produced a wonderful corpus of work on the history of communism, including much information from new archives. And he is currently the visiting professor of history at Bard College and CEO and executive director of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research in New York City. David Satter is, if he'll forgive the expression, an old Russia hand who's been covering Russia and the Soviet Union since before I was born, and the author of numerous books. He's also a fellow of the Hudson Institute here in town. Finally, we have Yelena Zhemkova, who is the executive director of Pamyat, or Memorial, the Russian memorial organization that looks at the communist past and maintains the most complete, possibly the most complete archives of the activities under communism. Memorial is very much in the news today and something that should be of great concern to all of us. So what we're going to do, the panelists have been asked to prepare short 10 to 12 minute statements about the current memory of the legacy of communism in the former Soviet Union particularly, and then we'll have some discussion moderated by myself, and finally some questions from the audience toward the end. I'll start with a brief overview of the history. One of the questions I'm most frequently asked by students is, why do we know so very much about the Holocaust and the history of Nazi Germany, but comparatively so little about the crimes of communism, about the Gulag, about the sad history of the Soviet Union? And the easiest answer that I've ever been able to come up with is that the histories are actually quite different. Nazi Germany suffered total defeat in World War II. Victorious allies occupied the country, liberated the concentration camps, brought the perpetrators to justice, freed the survivors, exposed the documentation, invited the international media in to photograph and document the horrors that had happened in Nazi Germany, and created a public culture that very much allows for a memorialization of this event, all with the precise purpose that this was a betrayal of the most basic principles of humanity that should never be allowed to happen again. In the case of the Soviet Union, none of this ever happened. The Gulag was never liberated. Not one perpetrator in the Soviet case was ever brought to justice. The victims were left, those who survived were left to live shattered lives, rebuilt in the shadow of a state and society ruled by the same government and ideology that had sent them to the Gulag in the first place, and could easily have done so again if it so wanted. Memorializing the events before 1991 was simply impossible. The documentation remains secret and still has yet to be fully revealed. The idea that you would be able to explore this even in a freer post-Soviet Russia, I say freer with a truckload of salt, but a freer post-Soviet Russia is extremely difficult. Yelena, I think, will be able to tell us about this in great detail from her work and her experiences and that of her organization. But the leadership of the country still largely comes out of the Soviet Communist Party, out of the security organs who perpetrated much of the violence. And as a result of that, we do know very much less about the Gulag than we do about the Holocaust. I hope today our panelists will be able to introduce more information, to give us a broader perspective on how the history of communism is remembered in post-Soviet Russia today, and what the problems and challenges of this would be. So why don't we start in perfect alphabetical order with Jonathan, and your comments, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the organizers. It's a real privilege to speak with you today. I want to begin by referring back both to what Professor Paul Hollander said on the first day about belief structures. Belief structures and memory are very highly tied together. In fact, one could say there is no memory without belief. I want also to talk a little bit about how the connection of memory to belief is related to what Dr. Landsbergis was saying earlier this morning about the destruction of the soul. This is a very big word, small but big, and I don't use it lightly. But what I think Dr. Landsbergis was referring to was the destruction of some inner principle of being human, what it is that makes us human. And one of the most important things is precisely our memory and the ability of our memory to reinforce and be reinforced by our beliefs. We can talk about the Katyn massacre, we can talk about the liquidation of the kulaks as a class, we can talk about the Great Terror and all of these hideous crimes, these cruelties that were meted out largely to innocent people. Millions of people died in the Gulag. We've heard that. The leadership of the Bolshevik regime has been characterized as a mafia, a mafioso group. And I think that that very characterization of them does not help us understand what actually happened. This was not a set of crimes that was committed by bad people, by evil people. Yes, they did evil things. They did bad things. These were crimes that were, in some sense, committed by a much larger structure that involved ideology, a total belief system, but it also involved something else that we have to talk about. We have to talk about the complicity of ordinary people. We have to talk about society and the way that society was terrorized and the way that society enabled. We have to talk about the children who denounced their parents. We have to talk about the wives that denounced their husbands. We have to talk about the workers who denounced their bosses. We have to talk about the insane cruelty of people who would denounce their neighbors because they had a few grains of wheat more than they did. This, too, we have to talk about, because part of the problem of memory in Russia today is that it isn't so easy to identify everyone who is guilty when so much of the whole society was complicit in this. There are numerous examples of this, numerous examples of wives denouncing husbands. Let's be clear about one thing. Denunciations were never, or very rarely, the actual causes of arrests and imprisonments. Rather, they were, for the most part, pretexts. Isaac Babel, the great Russian writer, started being denounced by many people years before he was arrested, and then he was arrested not for the reasons that he was denounced. Doctors in the doctor's plot were denounced long before they were arrested. So the denunciations by themselves were never the precipitating factor. What was the precipitating factor? When Anna Akhmatova was asked, why was so-and-so arrested? She gave the reason famously, why are you asking me why so-and-so was arrested? So-and-so was arrested for nothing. So-and-so was just arrested. And yet, there were reasons for it. there were. And one of the reasons, as Bukharin outlines in his letter to Stalin that he wrote in December of 1937, was to create a society of total distrust. A society in which people did not trust each other, a society in which people were always looking at each other suspiciously, always thinking about saving themselves before they themselves were denounced by their neighbors. And this is a society that is fundamentally destabilized. It is fundamentally, therefore, an illiberal society in which there is no longer a social contract. When one of the doctors of the doctor's plot, Vladimir Vinogradov, is interrogated, after he's been released in 1953 from jail, he's now being interrogated by Beria, who doesn't want to put him in jail again. He just wants to know what it was that Vinogradov said. What did the doctors actually do during the doctor's plot? Vinogradov falls silent. And the interrogator says to him, "Why have you fallen silent? Answer the question." And Vinogradov says, "I'm speechless. I have no words left. I cannot answer these questions anymore." Why? Because he has been so completely compromised by the system. Because he has denounced, he has recanted, he has lied, he has told the truth, he can no longer remember what the truth actually was. And this state of no longer knowing what the truth actually was is the state in which you cannot any longer remember anything clearly, in which in some fundamental and deep and very disastrous way for human civilization, the truth no longer exists. And this was the great, to my mind, civilizational, criminal act of the Soviet system. It destroyed the possibility of telling the truth. There are numerous examples of this, and perhaps in literature, the most interesting is the novel, the short novel, which I suggest all of you read, called Sofia Petrovna by Lydia Chukovskaya. She wrote it in 1939. It was never published in the Soviet Union. It was eventually published in the late 80s under Gorbachev, in which the mother, Sofia Petrovna, has been defending her son, and she believes in the greatness of Stalin and the greatness of the Soviet system. And finally, she gets a letter from her son. And the letter says, "Mother, please come and help me. I confessed to everything. They beat me terribly. I need you." And these words of his to her, "I have confessed to everything," it seems, in the framework of the novel, cause her to lose her mind. This son, the only son, her beloved son, and she takes the letter and she burns it. She burns it and stamps on it. And that act of burning the letter and stamping on the letter is precisely what Anna Akhmatova writes about in Requiem, where she says, when she looks in the mirror, now I must smash all my memories. Now I must rebuild myself piece by piece. In closing, I want to talk about a very strange thing that happened in 1957, when Dr. Zhivago was being published, and the Central Committee organized a commission to read the novel. And Dmitry Polikarpov was given the task of reading the novel. He reads the novel, and he comes to the conclusion it's a brilliant novel. Unfortunately, it's our enemy, he concludes. It's our enemy because it valorizes, it encourages bourgeois egoism, the bourgeois ego. It defends the bourgeois ego. A couple of months later, they send him into the countryside to find out what intellectuals are talking about and thinking about, because the Soviet government was always interested in this. And he writes a report, and the report is, these damned intellectuals, they don't care about the grain harvest, they don't care about Sputnik, they don't care about our advances in technology, they don't care about how great the Soviet Union is doing to fulfill its goals. All that these damned intellectuals care about are the crimes of Stalin that Khrushchev spoke about in the 1956 speech. And this is what he concludes. He concludes, comrades, it is obvious to me that our society is undergoing a deep and profound perestroika, and he uses the word perestroika in 1957. And then he says, it is our job to manage this process, and it won't be easy and it won't be quick. And when he says that, he is sending a signal that could only have been sent in at this point in time, that these writers are not to be shot. This process is not to be stopped. This process is to continue and develop, and they are going to be part of it. It is a tiny ray of hope. And despite the fact that in the American Academy today, there is so much provocation from left-wing intellectuals, left-wing historians, provocation against American liberal democracy, and a kind of pseudo-embrace of communism. I believe that there is also much room for hope that our children, if they can receive a signal from the top, as Polikarpov did, will eventually see that light as well. But I want to emphasize, I think I'm going over a little bit, so I apologize, but I want to emphasize that this matter of education is not just an ornament to us today. It is of the most dire importance in rebuilding American life today by remembering what it was that these hideous communist societies have done in the past. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I want to add a small detail of my life. This morning, I reviewed the conference program of another conference, the Association for the Study of East European, Slavic, East European and Eurasian Studies, which will be held this weekend in Chicago. The online program has a search feature. I typed in the word gulag. Bear in mind, please, that this is a 4-day conference involving hundreds of panels just like this one, involving thousands of people for the premier organization of the study of the former Soviet Union and neighboring regions in North America, and probably indeed in the world. How many hits did I get when I typed in the word gulag? 3. So Jonathan, you're absolutely right. I don't belong to this organization. I'm going to Hawaii instead. David, it's your turn.
Okay, thanks very much. I wanted to begin with a reference to the Soviet ideology, Marxism Leninism, which is arcane and repellent concept because it forces people to think about things they don't want to think about, and which was held up as a substitute for the entire religious heritage of the West. The reason I mention it is because it's important to bear in mind that people in the Soviet Union did not think of themselves as evildoers, and they didn't think of what they were doing as aggression and destruction. On the contrary, they were in the process of building a new world, and they wanted the blessings of that new world not only for themselves, but for everyone else as well. And anything that conflicted with this image of a perfect society, without class conflict, without war, in which everyone had a job and everyone was prosperous, anything that conflicted with that and the whole history of the violence through which that society was created, conflicted with it, was simply repressed. But it was always there, beneath the surface. In the years of the Soviet Union, I was a correspondent in Moscow between 1976 and 1982. The true terrible story was mentioned in rumors, in whispers, facts that couldn't be confirmed, information that someone had about a meeting somewhere with someone who may have seen, for example, Raoul Wallenberg. Those reports, of course, in the end were not verified. Others were, for example, that there had been a massacre in Novocherkassk of workers who protested against the rise in the cost of food products. But information was very hard to come by. And it was for that reason that the dissident movement was based basically on information, collecting truthful facts about the country's history. And it was also the reason why the first truthful information in the Soviet Union about the crimes of the Stalin period became available, because anyone in the leadership who wanted to get rid of his opponents, and the outstanding example was Khrushchev, who desperately wanted to get rid of Beria and his henchmen, had one available weapon. They could reveal a little bit of the truth about what had happened, about all the atrocities, and then blame their political opponents, and of course, while carefully masking their own crimes. And that, in fact, is the story of the 1956 secret speech. It's also the story of the 1961 speech by Khrushchev at the 22nd Party Congress, which went even further. And it's the story of perestroika. Because when Gorbachev set about to reform this totalitarian structure, ostensibly to make it more efficient and more capable of survival in the long run, he had to rely on free information, because only free information could be used against his political opponents to force them to carry out the measures that he had in mind for the country. Gorbachev himself was not capable of changing anything. Gorbachev had to be able to motivate and command the Communist Party apparatus that was totally opposed to any change to carry out his will. The way to do that was to turn to the population. And to turn to the population, he had to be able to make available information. But what happened during the years of perestroika was that the attention of the population turned to history, because these were the most damning facts of all. And the Memorial Foundation, which began in the mid-1980s, expanded to become the most powerful political not the most powerful, but certainly the largest, and in many ways the most influential political organization in the country. It wasn't registered, in part out of fear that it would become the basis for a very powerful political opposition. But it turned out that despite the hopes of the totalitarian regime, as Hannah Arendt said, the holes of oblivion did not exist. There was always someone who remembered something. the location of a site of a mass execution, the place where people were buried, the tortures and the confessions. And these stories began to come out and to appear in the Soviet press, and it absolutely revolutionized the consciousness of the country, because it was no longer possible to imagine that we in the Soviet Union are doing only good. We want only good things for the world, and the world for some reason hates us and will never let us live in peace. Suddenly it became clear that this heroic tale, which had been inculcated by official propaganda, was in fact concealing a bloody fabric of atrocities that had been carefully concealed, and that even people who had lived in the country, grown up at the time that these crimes occurred, had only vague notion of, in part because people were afraid to talk about it, in part because it was simply difficult and painful to believe. There was one incident that I recall that, just among many, about the perestroika use of history. There was a letter to Moskovskaya Pravda, I think, no, Вечерний Moskva, which is an evening newspaper in Russia, from someone who recalled his mathematics teacher in St. Petersburg. Then it was Leningrad. He said he recalled how he came, how he taught mathematics. He said that he was very strict. I wasn't sure if he would become my favorite teacher, but he was very conscientious. And then one day he disappeared. And then another teacher took his place. We never knew what happened to him. And he said now, reading the lists of the shooting victims in the Great Terror that they began to be published in the Soviet press, he found his name. He said, now I know what happened to him after so many years. But there was a problem with using history, again, with the controlled release of history without a commitment to the underlying values, because history began to be seen by everyone as a political weapon. And once it inspired people in part because it could be used as a weapon against the communist regime. And once that regime fell, the millions of people who had been active in the effort to resurrect the country's true history melted away, and there were only a small number of activists left from the Memorial Society. And the promises to create monuments to those who had died, which were in fact carved in stone in cities all over the country, in one locality after another, at the site of executions or just in general in the center of town, there were plinths and pedestals in which it was written, on this site will be constructed a monument to the victims of Stalinist terror. They're still there, but no monuments were ever constructed, because society's interest quickly shifted to other subjects, and the moral importance of resurrecting history, once there was no longer a political motive, was lost. 1996 in Magadan, the Mask of Sorrow, a monument by Ernst Neizvestny commemorating the victims of the Kolyma slave labor camps was unveiled, but that coincided with the 1996 presidential elections, in which Yeltsin was anxious to demonize the communists. So what has not happened, and what needs to happen in Russia today, is for there to be an awareness of the critical importance for the country's psychology of honoring the dead, commemorating the history, resurrecting the facts, independent of any political motive. And that, unfortunately, is not the case. That has not happened, because the whole communist experience including the dominance of Marxism Leninism, was only possible because the heritage of the West, which values the life and personality of the individual, was destroyed. That can only be resurrected by a reaffirmation of the importance of the individual, which of course, as a first step, requires the commemoration of those who were so mercilessly destroyed. Until Russia faces that challenge and is willing and able to live by the values of the West, including the importance of individual human life, and is able to commemorate those, literally at the present time, almost nameless millions who were destroyed, the country will not be able to emerge from the cycle of destructive dictatorship and contempt for human life in which it continues to be caught. Yeah.
Thank you, David, for those very profound insights. One thing I have noticed on the centennial of the revolution itself, on social media, people from Russian emigre families commemorated the event by posting pictures of ancestors who were executed. My mother-in-law actually did this with her great-grandfather, who was a Tsarist officer, shot in 1918. That seems to be a very new phenomenon, even in emigre communities, but I hope that's something that will spread. So if we can now go to our last panelist, to Yelena, who will be speaking through a translator today. She'll be receiving a prize tonight. The Truman Reagan Award is being offered to her and also to Natan Sharansky. So welcome, Yelena, and thank you for your comments and congratulations on your award.
Спасибо.
Thank you.
Влияние советского наследства очень велико.
The Soviet legacy influence is huge.
Во-первых, страх.
First of all, it's fear.
Мистический такой ужас обыкновенного человека перед огромным государством, которое все может.
The mystical fear that freezes a single person in front of the state mechanism, a machine that is capable of everything.
Не надо арестовывать многих. Достаточно арестовать нескольких, и страх вернется.
You do not have to arrest them all, you just arrest a few and the fear will be back.
Во-вторых, разобщенность людей.
Second of all, people are not united.
Тотальное взаимное недоверие.
Total distrust.
Уничтожение или ослабление любых горизонтальных связей между людьми, даже между родственниками.
Total distrust towards each and every one, even the weakening and destroyment of family ties and connections among people.
В-третьих, ксенофобия.
Number three,
Очень мощное отторжение всего чужого.
The xenophobic phenomenon when you reject everything that seems to be alien.
Всего, что не входит в стандарт.
Anything that does not comply with a standard.
Ксенофобия как продолжение конформизма, с одной стороны, и агрессивный национализм как продолжение ксенофобии.
So xenophobia is like a conformistic reiteration of resentment of anything that is foreign, and they feed off each other.
И, наконец, может быть, даже главное, опыт того, что выживание, условием выживания фактически является двоемыслие.
And finally, the fact that the dual mentality and dual thinking is the only survival mechanism.
И потом, как следствие этого, цинизм и, в общем, фактически утрата нравственных ценностей.
The result of which is cynical behavior and the loss of any values.
Вот это наследство, и оно давит.
This is the legacy that is oppressive.
Довольно много научных достижений в истории исследования террора, в том числе и в России.
There are lots of research, scientific and academic, on the terror topic, including in Russia.
А все-таки миф о Сталине очень силен, и тема Сталина очень актуальна.
But still, the myth of Stalin remains strong, and the topic of Stalin remains very vivid.
В некотором смысле Россия по-прежнему остается страной с непредсказуемым прошлым.
In many senses, Russia still continues to be a country with unpredictable past.
Почему? Почему нас, вот эта наша работа по переживанию, осмыслению прошлого оказалась такой трудной?
Why, and why is our work on processing and remembering the past turns out to be such a difficult task?
Надо сказать, что 30 лет назад, в перестройку, когда выплеснулись вся эта информация о преступлениях сталинизма, нам так не казалось.
You know, I should say that 30 years ago, during this influx of information about the Stalin regime crimes, we didn't think that way.
И все-таки почему так трудно?
But still, why is it so harsh?
Во-первых, потому что очень трудно разделить роли злодея и праведника.
Because it is, first of all, it's so very difficult to identify the evildoer and the good doer.
А
Their
обыкновенному
roles.
человеку это очень нужно.
And a common person, a simple person, really does need that.
Чтобы вот осмыслить трагедию, ему нужно себя отождествить. Ну, желательно, конечно, отождествить себя с добром.
To have this distinction, because for him to or her to decide what to do and what to feel, it's important to identify with either of the side, preferably with a good side.
Ну, в крайнем случае можно отождествить себя со злом, как это в Германии произошло, чтобы потом от этого зла отказаться.
In the worst case scenario, you can identify with the evil, which happened in Germany, but to do so that you will not repeat this in the future.
И поэтому в нашем случае очень многие люди воспринимают то, что произошло, в сущности, как просто национальную катастрофу, стихийное бедствие.
So practically, this is why many people in my country now perceive whatever happened as a natural cataclysm, some kind of natural catastrophic phenomenon.
Они сочувствуют жертвам,
They emphasize and sympathize with the victims,
но они не говорят, кто виноват.
but they do not say who was to be blamed in those crimes.
И еще очень тоже сложно и важно, что в отличие от нацистов, в Советском Союзе нацисты убивали чужих.
And what is really important to emphasize that unlike in Nazi Germany, the Nazis were killing people who did not belong, other people.
Евреев, поляков, русских, чужих.
Jews, Polacks, Russians, other people.
А мы убивали своих.
We were killing our own.
Это обычному человеку невозможно понять.
It's incomprehensible for a common person.
И поэтому для нового поколения, которое уже выросло в 90-е и в 2000-е, и которое советское прошлое либо не знает, либо не получило о нем нормальной информации,
Therefore, the new generation that was born and raised in the 90s and 2000s that does not remember the communist Soviet past or didn't probably receive enough information about it.
для него это советское прошлое становится золотым веком,
For
прекрасным.
this generation, this era becomes the Renaissance golden era.
И в этой ситуации, конечно, само собой практически возникает и фигура Сталина.
And naturally so, in this situation, the figure of Stalin refaces.
Не Сталина убийца и организатора террора, а Сталина прекрасного организатора побед.
Not the Stalin, the mass murderer and terror organizer, but the perfect organizer and victorious leader,
Модернизатора, победителя в войне.
innovator, and the victorious winner in the war.
Это не реальный Сталин, это, конечно, миф о Сталине.
This, of course, is not real Stalin. This is the myth of Stalin.
Мы уверены, что для настоящего понимания и осознания прошлого, и чтобы выходить из этих тупиков,
We do realize that to comprehend properly the past, and in order to find the way out of those blind alleys,
нам необходимо осознать свою гражданскую ответственность, не вину. Мы ни в чем не виноваты.
we have to identify with our civil consciousness, not the guilt. We're not to blame in anything.
ответственность гражданскую, которую на себя добровольно принимает каждый человек.
We have to identify with the civil and civic responsibility which each and every person accepts for himself.
Если он себя причисляет к какой-то исторической общности, и тогда он говорит, я отвечаю за то, что эта общность делает сегодня, и за то, что она делала вчера.
If he identifies with a civic society of any form of today, and then they say, I'm responsible for what my group has been doing yesterday, today, and what it will be involved in tomorrow.
И эта гражданская ответственность, конечно, требует каждодневного, просто обыкновенного труда.
And of course, the civic responsibility requires and demands everyday efforts on behalf of everyone.
Вопрос, много мы сделали или нет?
The question arises, have we done a lot or have we not?
Вот через неделю откроется в интернете база данных, собранная нами, на 3 миллиона биографий жертв репрессий.
In a year, we'll launch a database on our website on 3 million victims of repressions.
Не вообще миллионы, а 3 миллиона конкретных людей, конкретных жертв с конкретными биографиями.
Not just, some kind of oblivious millions, but 3 millions with real names, real biographies, real people behind those 3 million.
Но как это мало из тех многих миллионов, о которых мы говорим.
But how very little is this 3 million compared to many, many more millions that we've talked about.
Многие книги, выставки, например, список всех жертв Катыни, поименный с биографиями.
Lots of books, lots of exhibits, for example, the list of Katyn victims' names.
Это важно, а при этом люди говорят по-прежнему в России, что в убийстве в катынских жертвах виноваты немцы.
This is all crucially important, and nonetheless, there are people in Russia as of today who say that it is the Germans who are to blame in the death of the Katyn victims.
Неделю назад в Москве была акция памяти возвращения имен.
A week ago, there was an action conducted in Moscow, which was Give the Names Back.
Пришло больше 5000 человек.
More than 5,000 people showed up for the rally.
Прийти мог любой.
Anyone could partake.
Мы только приготовили биографии и сказали, пожалуйста, вы хотите почтить память, придите, мы дадим вам биографии, вы будете читать.
We just told them, look, if you want to partake in the rally and if you want to commemorate their memories, come on over, we'll provide you with the materials, you can read up on them.
Мы получили разрешение власти. Мы не хотим звать людей на неразрешенную акцию.
We did get the state permit for the rally. We didn't want to not have a sanctioned and authorized one.
Люди стояли в очереди с 10 утра до 10 вечера.
People lined up for the event, and they started lining up at at 10 a.m., and they were still in line until 10 p.m.
29 октября в Москве уже очень нехорошая погода.
And believe you me, on the 29th of October, Moscow, weather is not a pretty one.
И люди стояли некоторые по 4 часа, чтобы прочесть всего одну биографию.
And some people were really standing in line for 4 hours to just read one single biography.
Но 5000 человек, много ли это для Москвы, где живет больше 13 миллионов?
But 5,000 people in attendance, is it a lot for a city of Moscow where we have 13 million?
Сделано много, действительно очень много. Не стыдно.
We have done a lot, really a lot. We're not embarrassed or ashamed.
Как говорила моя бабушка, когда тебя на том свете спросят, что ты сделал, есть что сказать.
As my grandma used to say, when you check out in paradise and they ask you about your achievements, you will not be embarrassed to give them a report of what you've done.
А ощущения победы нет.
But we still didn't have the feeling of victory.
Значит ли это, что мы не должны были делать то, что мы делали?
Does it mean that we shouldn't have done what we've done?
Конечно, нет. Если мы будем помнить, что ключ к истории, к этой трагедии — это биография конкретных людей,
Of course not. If we will all remember that the key to solve this tragedy in history is to remember the biography of each and every person.
Ну, мы просто должны продолжать, и это, видимо, будет очень длинный путь.
So we just should continue on the path, and the road we have to travel is going to be a long one.